We did lose one member last week, Margaret By. Peggy By passed away last Friday, the 28th. Yeah, she has not been well since the fall. And she was at her daughter's in Maryland, and it was very peaceful and quiet. She passed in her sleep. There will be services for her later on in the springtime. Obviously not now in all the snow. So just so you know, keep Peggy in your prayers and her family. Please silence your phones. And I would like to thank Jonah and Cindy, PAC-B TV, for coming and and taking our get-together. All right, tonight we have Jim Papaya, rhymes with
Papaya.
Yeah, you remember. And Tim Carroll, local authors. I'm sorry, Tim, I can't rhyme your name. Sorry.
Barrel.
Okay, rhymes with barrel. We got you. They're going to talk about Lake Minnetonka in Fulton. Very, very interesting lake. You know, it took me a long time before I could get the name straight. But it should be very, very interesting. And then afterwards, we have a lot of their books. And we're just going to turn it over to Jim. Yay. Thank you so much, both of you.
All right. That'll think about getting out of winter, this picture here, huh? So, hey, thanks for having me here. I've seen many of you before, and I've usually written books on my own, but Tim and I went to high school together. We graduated, and a couple of years ago, this will tell you how old we are, we had our 50th class reunion, and Tim and I decided we put together a little book of memories about our class and the years that we graduated, that sort of thing. And we had a lot of fun doing it, and so when we got done, we thought, let's do a real book. And so we're going to share. You are our very first program. The book's not even out yet. It'll be out shortly. So bear with us as this is our first time presenting the program with everybody. But what we wanted to start with is, well, first of all, if you saw the plaque here that Tim hung, we're not promoting stores in Fulton, but if you know where the Village Shops is by Price Chopper, she sells a lot of Fulton memorabilia and things. She had that sitting there in her store, and I said, oh, we got to have that for when we start doing our program. So we want to hopefully, maybe, anybody spend time at the lake or at Recreation Park when you were younger or through the year? Okay. So we're hopefully going to capture some of those memories for you today. So we're going to start off with a little bit about our personal memories. I lived in the country. I lived on Chase Road outside of Fulton. It's about a mile from the lake and the park. And one of my favorite memories is my brother and I riding our bikes in the summertime. And we'd spend the whole day swimming at the beach here. So I'm going to start flicking the pictures. Tim's going to take it from here.
I also grew up in Fulton. I learned to swim when I was about 5 years old at Stevenson Beach. The final exam, they kicked us over to the west side pool. We had to jump in the deep end, which was very frightening. As 5 years old, I looked like I was about 3. I was just a little one. So that might as well have been jumping into the abyss of the Pacific. We moved to Mexico, New York. My grandparents still lived in Fulton, so my mom or dad would take me and my brother into Fulton regularly. All summer we'd be going there to swim. And it was always a big deal to go into town and hit the lake. I continued, as I told Jim on the way up here, other than the times I moved out of here, I was either in the lake, on the lake, or by the lake every month of the year for, well, probably 68 out of my 70 years so far. So it has been a big part of my life. My first real job was working at the beach after my senior year in high school. So really what this is about, a lot of it is memories. These two young bucks here are classmates of ours. That's Frank or Paco on the left and John or Hector on the right. The lake has always been very well known for fishing. These are two fairly good-sized bikes. Now imagine you're an 11-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy. They both lived about 2 or 3 blocks from the lake. They could walk down there, wet their line, and pull out a fish almost as big as them. That's got to be a great memory to have. And again, how many people could just go walk out their backyard and do something like that? And there were hundreds of other people from Fulton who do the same thing. Next slide, Jim. Okay, the lake was also very well known for boating, motorboating, sailboating, canoeing, now kayaking, and even ice boating. That picture you had back there, we had when I worked at the beach, the lifeguards had a boat there, and I had the key when I had to go open up in the morning. Papa and I would go there before the beach opened, take the boat out, fishing out on the lake, bring it back in before the lifeguards came. Several years later, I got into high school. Hector and a friend of ours had a boat. There were 5 of us learned to water ski on Lake Neonawanda behind that boat. So again, it was a big part of our lives through our formative years. This is going to be, Jim and I are both going to talk about this just a little bit. I'll say my background is more along the technical side of things. Jim is a real writer, so kick off first and we'll get you back behind your...
I wouldn't say I'm a real writer, but I do like collecting stories. I like, but the history that I like to work on is people's personal history. So that's kind of how we tag team this book, as you'll see as we go along here. This is the recreation part, which so you imagine the lake right behind us here where the camera is. And you know, I didn't come from a wealthy family, so we didn't take road trips, we didn't go cross country, things like that. So for us, the big deal was, you know, Sundays, pack a picnic lunch, come down to Recreation Park. We kids would swim all day and we'd have meals. And as you can see, many of the memories that we collected were people remembering things like that at the park. So, okay. Did I screw that up?
Nope, nope, you're good.
Back to you, Tim.
For me, when we moved to Mexico, we moved next to a creek. I knew from a very young age, when I was about 6 years old, I wanted to be a biologist. So between the time I spent on the lake in Fulton, fishing, catching frogs, whatever, and by the creek in Mexico doing the same thing, but throwing snakes and other sorts of things into the mix, I ended up pursuing that and specialized in freshwater wetland ecology. So that's my background. I just fell in love with swamps, and as you're going to find out, there's a fairly good swamp component to Lake Neonawanda. Hit the next one, Jim.
Next one.
I think we want to go to the area over here. We go. All right, this is just for those of you who might not be familiar with the area, just to kind of point things out for you. This is Lake Neonawanda here. This direction is facing north. This is the Oswego River, winding across the middle of it. The city of Fulton is in the middle. Originally, this was formed from 2 villages. It's the village of Fulton on the east side and the village of Oswego Falls on the west side. The outlet of Lake Neonawanda goes right about there. I'm not as tall as I used to be. And winds basically parallel the river. And if you look up in the upper left, you see a little green blob in the river. That is Pathfinder Island. Those of you familiar with James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote the Pathfinder and The Last of the Mohicans and Deerslayer, a lot of that took place in central New York in the Fulton Oswego area. So Pathfinder Island was named after that. So Tannery Creek, the outlet from here that drains out, a little bit north of Pathfinder Island, and just before you get to Battle Island Golf Course. I imagine most of you are familiar with the state park there. Make sure I didn't miss anything here. One of the interesting things about this lake is it's about 5 miles all the way around. Town of Granby is on this side, and this is the Fulton side. From about here, this is our recreation park here, but the public access goes from about North Bay all the way around here to where the high school and junior high are. That's about 2.5 miles in public ownership. You would be very hard pressed to find a small body of water anywhere in New York State that's not lined with camps with 50 feet of frontage or factories or huge farms. It's a tremendous opportunity, recreational opportunity, to have 2.5 miles of land on the lake in public ownership. Next one, Jim. Very briefly, this is how the lake formed. It's a remnant of the lake, the ice ages from millions of years ago. There have been 4 ice ages in New York State over the years, over the last 2 million years. The last one began about 75,000 years ago. By about 25,000 years ago, it reached its maximum extent and covered essentially all of New York State except for Long Island. About that point, it started receding as the climate warmed. By about 12,000 years ago, the glacier had receded to basically north of most of New York State. But left in its wake was this huge lake called Lake Iroquois. As the glacier melted, it created, there's an ice dam, you can see where it says Laurentide ice sheet. That blocked off the drainage of Lake Iroquois to St. Lawrence, where Lake Ontario drains now. So drainage was via what is now the Mohawk River, down to the Hudson and into the Atlantic Ocean. Eventually, the glacier receded, the old drainage, the current drainage was restored, so it drains up through the St. Lawrence River, and this is the current boundary of Lake Ontario. And obviously this is a little tail end of Oneida Lake here. This is the location of Lake Neotawana, which is basically just a little depression in the lake bed under Lake Iroquois. A couple other remnants that were left here that we're going to talk about also today. Lake Neotawana, Peter Scott Swamp, which some of you may be familiar with, near Pennellville Schuylkill area, and Oneida Lake. Those will be addressed in a few minutes. Okay, Jim. So once the glacier receded, there were 3 different Native American cultures that occupied the area from about 10 to 12,000 years ago until the first European settlers. Excuse me. There were the Paleo-Indians, the archaeologists call them the Paleo-Indians, the Archaic culture, and the woodland culture. Now, the Paleo-Indians were nomadic hunters of megafauna, mastodons, giant ground sloths. You probably would count bison and moose as part of megafauna. Their main hunting tool was the fluted point. This was a big part of the culture. Those of you familiar with some archaeology would recognize that. Up above is the second culture, the Paleo, or the Archaic culture. This is characterized by the Lamoka culture on here, which is a small lake in western Finger Lakes. The archaeologists have found a lot of evidence of that culture there. What they that culture ended up developing was the atlatl. This was basically a hunting weapon that created a much more force and accuracy using that little curved stick with a notch on one end and throwing a spear. It allowed them to take down the smaller, more agile game that was there after the megafauna left. There's evidence of that tribe, of that culture around Brewerton, Pennellville. Archaeological digs have found a lot of evidence of them. This last one characterized, this is the Three Sisters. I think a lot of you may be familiar with that from the Iroquois culture. So the woodland culture is represented by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also called the Iroquois Confederacy, specifically the Onondaga Nation. The Onondaga Nation had permanent settlements south of Syracuse. Didn't miss anything important here. So because they had basically become agriculture farmers, they were able to have permanent settlements. They would travel north to and around the area for hunting and fishing trips. But these are the three cultures that existed in there before the settlers first came in. Go ahead, Jim.
You want to mention, Tim, that you did a fictionalized version?
Oh, that's right, yeah. In the book, there is a fictionalized narrative of each of these cultures representing how they may have used Lake Neotawana. So there's no evidence found of the Paleo-Indians on the lake, near the lake. Mastodon bones have been found south of Oneida Lake. That spear point is a picture of what was found in Darien and Genesee County. But each one, there's a little chapter that kind of talks about how they would have used the lake. Thanks for pointing that out, Jim.
You're welcome. Here we go.
All right. So the Onondagas are the ones that named this lake Neotawana. And there's also a translation that says the little lake near the big lake. And I'm going to give you guys a little spoiler alert. Don't fall in love with that spelling or that translation. There's been a lot of history of that over the years, which we will get into. By the way, that sign was taken down last year. Not because of the name change or anything like that, but there was an upgrade to some of the facilities at North Bay Campground. This is on the north side of the lake, and this was a sign at the entry road down to the campground.
Okay.
All right, Jimmy, up.
Okay. I think we're going to switch places here. All right.
Yes, it is.
So Tim covered the chapters about the Native American tribes that were here, and I helped with the chapter about the first European settlers that came here. So what you're seeing is an artist rendition of the two villages, both on the east side and the village of Oswego Falls on the west, Oswego River coming through late 1800s. This is a depiction of Asa Phillips, who was one of the first settlers in the Fulton area. You may know this, but just for clarity, one of the reasons that Fulton exists today and those two villages existed were the rapids and the two small fall areas that the Oswego River produced in this area. People on canoe, whatever they were going on the water with, could not go navigate those rapids and those falls without being in danger. So they actually would get out right before the rapids started and usually would walk on the east side of the river down a mile or so past the rapids and the falls and then get back in. And so when they came out, they started looking for food. Pretty soon somebody said, maybe we could, have a place for people to stop and eat. And that's how the settlements began. The other thing to know, that most of the industry and the development was on the east side of the river. And that's where our factories started and we're the downtown area. And some of that was primarily because the riverbank on the west side was much steeper and it was hard to get that water power that was more readily available on the east side. But Asa Phillips was really interested in the west side, and he tried very hard to start a village there. He built a hotel there, built the first school in that area, trying to develop it. Never was as successful as on the east side, but we can go to the next slide. But one of the things that developed on the west side was farmland. And there certainly were farms on the east side, but there were a lot on the west side. Different kinds of farms. This is a picture of a muck farm. Some of you know that I wrote a book about the muck farms of Oswego County. This is a farm on County Route 7 between Fulton and Oswego. But there were also dairy farms and upland farms. And as farmers began to develop, more and more farms came. So I start the chapter about the farms in the 1840s. And the census in Oswego County at that time was 8,600 farms in Oswego County, many of those in the Fulton, Oswego area. And that was those farms had about half the population of Oswego County just on the farms. So farms were very prevalent, and again, especially on the west side of what eventually would become the city of Fulton. You can go to the next slide, Tim. And so I want to talk a little bit about an organization called the Oswego County Agricultural Society. And this was a group of farmers that banded together to share planting ideas, techniques, new farm technology, and also to be social. Farming is sort of an isolated activity, and so they wanted to have a place to come together. In 1840, they founded the society in the town of Oswego, and that first year, they had the first Oswego County Fair. It was fairly well attended, but the rest of the county felt a little slighted. Why are we doing everything in the town of Oswego when we have a big county here? So they decided to move the fair to different locations. In 1844, 4 years after they founded, they held the first fair in the town of Oswego, in the town of Oswego Falls, right on Lake Neonawana. So we can go to the next picture. And what a fair it was. This is very early pictures of the Oswego County Fair in the town of Oswego Falls, right on Lake Ontario. If you look real hard, you can see Lake Neonawana. I'm sorry, folks. You can see Lake Neonawana in the background there, so you can see the position of that park area. Mostly at the beginning, it was big tents that they erected and put up, but drew in big crowds. 30,000 visitors in the 4 days of a fair in some years. So in 1844 was the first year they did it, but they had made this agreement that they were going to travel around the county and have the fair in different places, so they moved around the county. But people couldn't forget about how nice it was by that lake and how beautiful that spot was. So in 1855, see if I get my date right, yes, 1855, they permanently made the Oswego County Fair in the town of Oswego Falls, right on the lake. See if what else I want to say about that. We can go to the next slide. So to bring in more people, so there was farm, people brought their produce, but they also wanted to have entertainment. They put in a racetrack, horse track, and again, it drew in. Look at the people, the crowds there in the grandstands. And then next slide, they also brought in, here's an acrobat. I heard stories or read newspaper articles about the first airplanes. This is again early 1900s, late 1800s. First airplane, first people parachuting, first automobiles some people ever saw were at the Oswego County Fair, and it became the place in central New York to go. This was before the New York State Fair, and you know, as I mentioned, 30,000 visitors. Okay, let's see. So we're going to tag team here again, but before I sit down, I want to give you some location. Here's the Oswego River, the two villages. Here's the lake that Tim's going to talk about, but here's Oswego County Agricultural Society. So they had purchased this land and began what became a recreation area in Fulton. So, boy, that light is bright when you go back and forth.
All right, one other thing to notice about this, a couple things. I think this was probably a map from sometime in the later 1800s. It indicates the Delaware-Lackawanna Railroad tracks there, which was a main vehicle for people getting to the fair for many years. But also what's noteworthy here is notice this little chunk of Lake Neotawana down here. It also says Granby Lake, Fish Lake, along with Lake Neotawana. So I told you not to fall in love with the name and the spelling up there. The name Fish Lake first appeared on maps from about Jim, you got me this.
Sorry.
In the wrong century. 1790. They were maps of the military tracks. Military tracks were laid out on the west side of the Oswego River, millions of acres, and were given to soldiers of the Revolutionary War in lieu of payment because the new nation didn't have the cash to pay all those poor suckers. The first written, outside of maps, the first written mention of Fish Lake that I could detect was by DeWitt Clinton. If you remember, some of you remember DeWitt Clinton was the governor of New York State. Well, in 1810, he was tasked, before he was governor, he was tasked with finding a water route from Albany to Buffalo. And he kept a journal of his route, of his travels through there. And in that canal journal, he mentions stopping by Fish Lake and kind of complimented what a nice piece of work it was. By 1811, he finally started seeing the name show up in print. It was in the 1811 Gazetteer, and there were some statistical manuals and books that mentioned Fish Lake. At one point, before Oswego County was formed, Fish Lake was in Onondaga County, and when Oswego County formed, Fish Lake was in Oswego County, and those statistical manuals kind of tracked the travels of Fish Lake through there. All right, Jim, next slide, please. Okay, now you remember Jim mentioned Asa Phillips. This map is from 1829. And what you might notice, if you recall the first couple slides, the shape of Lake Neotawana, this is very bizarrely shaped. I'm not sure who the guy who walked that down was. He spent too much time at Phillips Hotel drinking. But Jim had mentioned that Asa Phillips wanted to start a village on the west side of the river. So in a fit of ego, he decided to call the village Phillipsville and name the lake Phillips Lake. Some of the old maps say Phillipsville. This one just says Phillips for the village. I was not unable to find any of the maps that actually said Phillips Lake on there. I think it was just something that he wanted and it was recorded that way. But eventually he was unable to implement his plans, so he abandoned the plans for the village and moved to New York City. For a while, it was also called, you saw Granby Lake sometime in the 1840s. I got that one right. 1840s. Again, next slide, Jim. By 1854, this map was, you can kind of notice the shape of the Neotawana is a little bit better now than the old Drunken Fish Lake one from before. This map was by a surveyor, based on surveys by an individual named, what is his name? Samuel Guile, that's it. So again, this is the first time you see Lake Neotawana on maps. In 1860, shortly thereafter, a surveyor Peter Schenk, or Schenk, I'm not sure what the pronunciation is, Schenk, I believe, who was a friend of Asa Phillips and actually did the surveys for laying out the village of Phillipsville. In 1858, there was a project to drain much of the land around Lake Neotawana, and in 1860, Peter Schenk surveyed the area, created a map that listed all the landowners around there, had the shape of Neotawana we have today, and also called it Neotawanta. That was the first record that we could find where it was used locally. This map was printed, I believe, in Philadelphia by Philadelphia map makers, but Schenk actually used it in Fulton for the local area. So that seems to be the first time it was actually the local map. Now, a couple things about, so you've seen this has gone through, we've got Fish Lake and Phillips Lake, then back to Fish Lake, then Granby Lake, then Neotawanta. You would think that maybe at that point that in 1860 the controversy was finally finished, but it really wasn't. And a couple quotes here. The Oswego Daily Times in 1878 published the following. Excuse me for reading off the text, I couldn't remember all this. The beautiful sheet of water opposite Fulton, near the Fulton station, was for many years dubbed Fish Lake and Granby Lake. It has been called, and a one-time attempt was made to have it called Lake Como, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We think it was the late Peter Schenk of Oswego Falls who had the good sense to hunt up the Indian name Neotawanta. We think it will be from this time on Neotawanta. However, just a few years later, in 1892, your friend and ours, William Beauchamp, wrote the following in the Weekly Recorder, which I believe, you guys might help me out, was the newspaper in Fayetteville, or a periodical in Fayetteville where he was living at the time. His quote, Fish Lake near Oswego Falls has suffered the infliction of several names, but the first seems most appropriate. 300 pickerel were shot along the shores on April 4th, and they weighed from 5 to 10 pounds each. Wow. So it still hasn't, there people are still stumping for one or the other. Now regarding the Lake Como, that appears to be one of the earlier efforts at branding, which is, branding is so important today to get your name on everything. There was a group of people that started calling it Lake Como and advertising in the Syracuse and Binghamton newspapers to spend a wonderful day at Lake Como. Church picnics, fraternal organizations and such would take the train to Fulton and have their little affair at Lake Como. Lake Como is a well-known area for the rich and famous in Europe and Italy. It's been for the rich and famous since Roman times, and it's still a big deal. People still go to Lake Como. Obviously the name didn't stick, but it did draw people here for a while from outside the area. Speaking of rebranding, there was an effort to rebrand the Oswego County Fair, and Jim is going to talk about that a little bit. How about that transition?
Nice, very smooth. As Tim mentioned, people from lots of places in central New York, Syracuse, Rochester, were coming to Fulton for either Lake Como or Lake Granby or whatever they called it because of this beautiful. And we really got to sink our teeth into this gentleman to find out what he did to develop the park. This is John Stevenson. We'll talk a little bit about John, born in the mid to late 1800s. And at 17 years old, he went to work for a place called the Woolen Mill in Fulton. If you're familiar with the Woolen Mill, or if you're not, as you can imagine, it produced clothing. And it was founded in 1859. By 1876, there were 500 looms in those buildings. And people that remembered talked about walking down the street near that factory area, hearing those looms clicking and clacking, right? So really, it was one of the biggest factories employing between 1,000 and 2,000 people. John Stevenson started there at age 18, and he worked 37 years there, working his way up to management. And one of the things we learned about John was everything John did was big. He did everything in a big way, kind of like a big guy too. But here's an example. When he became into management, and the Woolen Mill had an employment problem, or they needed to get people to fill positions, one time John rented a train car, took it down to New York City, went to Ellis Island, got the people off the boat and said, want a job? Put them in the railroad car, brought them to Fulton, employment problem solved. So he did things in a big way. Early on in his adult career, he joined the Agricultural Society as being on their board. And he noticed the potential of what a great facility it was. So let's talk about in the 1920s, now I gotta go to the in the 1920s, the Agricultural Society decided that maybe the Fulton site wasn't the best place for their county fair. And here's why. By the 1920s, Fulton became a factory town pretty much. Many people, there were still farms of course, but many people worked in factories, and they really wanted their county fair to be in a more rural setting. So in 1921, they decided to move the Oswego County Fair to Sandy Creek, where it remains today. And we're going to abandon the fairgrounds. And John Stevenson saw that as a big potential. And he convinced his bosses at the woolen mill to buy the fairgrounds from the Agricultural Society to create a more expansive park, and that's what he did. So, yep, you can go to the next slide, Tim. And this is a couple pictures of what John Stevenson imagined and produced. And what we're showing you here is sort of the end result. So you got to picture this going in step by step. But the first thing that he did, and we'll be able to see this in the next slide a little better, is he put in an auditorium, a huge auditorium that was big enough for big dances and parties and big banquets, things like that. And then he put in an open-air dance pavilion. He wanted it in a place where couples could dance. There's the lake in the background there with the breeze coming in off the lake. And then the third thing he did was brought in a children's carousel. And there's an interesting story about that carousel. He couldn't get the woolen mill to agree to pay for it at first, but because the way he thought, he went ahead and ordered the carousel on his own. And there's a story in the book about how that all turned out. But anyway, we can go to the next slide. This is from a newspaper clipping, so it's a little bit harder to read. That top picture, if you're looking up from the lake, or no, I'm sorry, right here, this bottom picture. Here's the lake, we're on the lake, there's the boats that were on the promenade area. There's that dance pavilion there. You can see the auditorium. Just a huge complex. People describe it almost like going to the Emerald City in the Wizard of Oz, this sort of place. And in 1922, a year after the woolen mill bought it, John Stevenson opened the park. By the way, the woolen mill bought the park so it could be a recreation place for their employees. But John Stevenson, again, was thinking big, and he said, why not open this up to the whole city of Fulton and visitors as well? And that's what they did. Opening day, nearly 20,000 people attended the opening day of that first year. That's how popular it was. So this went on for all of the 1920s, which we know from our history was the Roaring 20s, a really good financial time. But by the end of the 20s, along comes the Great Depression. And Fulton is kind of known as the city the Depression missed. And by that, many of the factories never closed down, and there were a lot of jobs. But truth be told, all the factories did take a hit when the Depression, including the woolen mill. And they really started to feel that they couldn't support. This was all free entertainment for the city and its employees. The dancing, the carousel was all free, and it became to be a financial burden on them. So we're now into the late 20s, 1927. John Steven is now the mayor of Fulton. That's how much he was loved by the community. And his health took a turn for the worse. 2 years later, he died. And by this time, the woolen mill really was not able to support this fair. So it was in disarray. Let's go to the next slide. And in 1933, the city of Fulton came to the rescue of this park, which had pretty much been abandoned. You can kind of imagine not being taken care of. And they purchased the park from the woolen mill. And let's see what I have some. So from in the 30s, we can go to the next slide. They tried to continue John Stevenson's big ways. Here's a dance marathon that was held in 1933, a 112-day. 112 day. Can you imagine? And that's why there's two nurses on either side to sit and they brought in big bands. The Ozzie Nelson band came to Fulton, things like that, to try to continue that big ways. But it, this is Depression era. It was just really struggling, and it just began to go downhill. They put in a bowling alley, trying to bring in new people. They had sporting events, but it was never the the acclaimed place that it was when John Stevenson was alive. So it sort of hobbled along into the 30s, and in the early 1940s, in 1943, we can go to the next slide, tragedy hit, and the recreation center the auditorium that John Stevenson dreamed of and built, caught fire and burned to the ground. And here's all front page news about what that meant. So, things again were kind of at a standstill there. By 1949, the dance pavilion that John Stevenson put in also burned to the ground. And so the city of Fulton knew they needed to do something. Their huge auditorium where they had big events was no longer available. And they started putting plans together. In 1949, after World War II, of course, it ended, they decided to put up what was called the War Memorial. Go to the next slide. Here's a modern picture of that War Memorial. They started the production of that in 1949. By 1953, it was completed, and it became a testimonial to the soldiers and the wars that our country has fought in, as well as a huge center for recreation. Go to the next slide. 2 years later, 1955, the year Tim and I were born, and maybe some of you, they put in the West Side Pool. Now remember, Lake Ontario is a stone's throw away. Why do you need a pool when there's a lake? Well, baby boomers, population growing, and they put in this pool. You can see the War Memorial, that's the side of the War Memorial there, to satisfy the swimming. So this sort of revived. And by the way, in I forgot to mention that when the city purchased from the woolen mill in 1933 was the first time it was officially called Recreation Park. And that's where that name came from. So I think we're going to switch it back over to Tim here. Right? Or did I leave something? No. Okay. You covered it.
All right, from the time that the West Side Pool opened, that was kind of the last development for a while. For the next 30 or 40 years, there was limited development along the lake shore, other than some development of a campground up at North Bay. But in that interim, the concerns began to arise about the condition of the lake. The water was becoming murky. There was an imbalance in the fish population. Some people thought there were too many small fish. Others thought there weren't enough big fish. Weed beds started encroaching on some of the areas, impacting boating and swimming. And all that was basically due to the aging of Lake Neodawana. Can you go to the next one, please? Okay, remember earlier when I had the glacial slide up there and it said that three things were remained from the little depressions, and the three we're going to talk about are Oneida Lake up on top, Neodawana down here, and Peter Scott Swamp. These were all born at the same time. These were all born 12,000 years ago, so from that standpoint, they're the same age. But all three of them are a different ecological age. Each one wants to grow up to be a forest. That's what and these are small lakes. A small shallow lake in upstate New York wants to become a forest eventually. Beech, birch, maple, hemlock, that sort of thing. And that whole process is really a function of the size of the lake, the depth of the lake, and how much water comes in and out. Oneida Lake is about 50,000 acres. Depending on who you read, Neodawana is somewhere between 650 and 700 acres. Peter Scott Swamp is about 400 acres. You can see Oneida Lake, big lake, 35, 40 feet deep. A lot of water coming in, a lot of water going out, turning it over. Neodawana, much smaller, say 400 or 700 acres. Has the one drainage and a few small feeder streams that come in. Peter Scott Swamp, this is the Oneida River right here. This is 6 Mile Creek going through here. Now you notice, just to kind of set the stage, Oneida Lake up in the upper left, you'll see 3 Mile Bay, Big Bay Swamp, I think. And some of the areas on the lake, those are wetlands. Cattail Marsh has some wooded forest. This is the lake trying to turn into a forest. It's kind of hard for these things to grow in 30 feet of water, but they're encroaching on the shoreline. Peter Scott Swamp, on the other hand, all this is cattail marsh. These little bluish spots here, that's the only open water in what was probably a former lake. I'm going to guess this thing was only a few feet deep when it was first formed. And Neodawana, this is a big cattail marsh over here all the way around the west side of the lake. So it's, again, and this lake is probably about, at one point was 16 feet deep, now they figure it's about 13 feet because a lot of muck and stuff has gone in there. So bottom line is, they're all developing different, they're all different ecological age. And we tend to think of them as being old, but really, these are kids. It's been 12,000 years since these formed, no forest here yet. So again, they were like different birth weights when they're born, so they all developed differently. That's a function of how much water is in there initially and how much water is coming in and out. So again, these are really fairly young in ecological terms. So 12,000 years old, but different ages based on how they're developing. Next slide, please, Jim. So by the late 1800s, 1980s, nutrient levels had increased in the lake due to runoff from surrounding farms, fertilized lawns, parking lots, storm sewer overflow, inadequate septic systems, and excuse me, algae and bacteria were starting to enter the lake. Make sure I get this here. Okay, so one of the problems with this is what lakes want to do. Neodawana's a shallow lake. It's going to get warm, nutrients are going to build up. It's going to develop these conditions. It's not hurting the lake. It's what the lake wants to do. The way I describe it, it's Neodawana is a teenager, and that's lake acne. It's unsightly with murky water and pea green soup. It doesn't hurt the lake at all. It's what it's supposed to do. It's going to outgrow that eventually, but it's not really good for swimming. People don't like that. In fact, the public health laws have specifications for how far you're able to see in the water for search and rescue type stuff, and of course, the possible toxins from blue-green algae and E. coli, that sort of thing. So in 1988, after an E. coli, which closes a lot of the beaches around you, I'm sure you see that in the papers all the time, Lake Neodawana was closed to swimming. It has never reopened since 1988. They weren't able to really get water clarity, that sort of thing, enough to open it up. Next slide, Jim, please. So after the lake was closed, the public began to mobilize. They wanted their recreation area back. So in 1988, the first Lake Neodawana Reclamation Committee was formed. I was on that original committee in 1988. What the committee did was trying to determine what were the issues with the lake, how could they be fixed. And they came up with recommendations, and helped implement some of the restoration options. Among them were watershed management, that's taking care of the stuff, the farmlands and stuff, what's getting into the lake, mechanical weed cutting or weed harvesting to open up some of the areas for boaters. I'd say it's still okay to boat on there, it's not going to, there's no damage that way. And also dredging operations to try to remove some of the nutrient-laden sediment and to deepen the areas to make it more difficult for vegetation to grow. This is a photo of the dredging operation in Fulton along, this would be just below where the Agricultural Society, Stevenson Beach will be back over here, and you go all the way around this way, and you will find the outlet of the lake. The dredging and the watershed management practices that were implemented have shown some reduction of phosphorus in the lake over the last 15 or 20 years based on some studies performed by the Forestry School at Syracuse. Unfortunately, the water's still too murky, the blue-green algae blooms still occur every summer, and swimming is still not able to be done, mostly because you can't open a swimming beach there without the right water clarity, and that just is not being accomplished yet. So there was widespread public support for all these efforts to try to remediate the lake. And lately, there's been a new proposal that came out, which is kind of what spurred Jim and I to write this book at a public meeting, some new efforts to try to remove the phosphorus from the water and again make the lake swimmable and usable. Next slide, Jim. At the same time, some of this in-lake remediation, watershed remediation was going on. Spurred by the Reclamation Committee, there was also some lakeside development. As I noted, there wasn't much going on after the West Side Pool had gone in. So by the 1990s, they decided they wanted to get some lakeside development to draw people to the lake. And you may have heard us talk about Bullhead Point. I don't know if we've mentioned that yet, maybe not. Bullhead Point is an area on the lake right near where Tannery Creek leaves it. It's along Route 3 on the kind of northeast side of the lake. That was a very shallow area. In the 1970s, some of you people remember Fulton downtown got a big urban renewal grant. They leveled all the old buildings that you would have seen from the 1920s and put in a new, what was supposed to be kind of a modern mall. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, but nobody could foresee the suburban malls coming up. Regardless, a lot of the demolition debris from that 1970s urban renewal was taken to Bullhead Point, which is this whole area here, which is right along Route 3 when you're heading out of town towards Hannibal. So they dumped a lot of the demolition debris there and just kind of left it. It was rutted, and the area is used for people after hours drinking when the bars closed down, or to walk down to the lake and fish, but it really was not a usable area. So the Reclamation Committee got involved, got some money, and started doing some development there. What you're seeing here is a pier and a gazebo. One of the reasons was this, to be able to get people beyond the weed beds if they wanted to fish out there, walk on it. Now, originally, that pier was supposed to be quite a bit longer. So when they were doing the sounding, trying to find solid support underneath to drive the pier posts in, as they got farther out, they couldn't find a bottom. It was just too mucky. So they had to shorten it because in order to build the pier out, it had to support the weight of an ambulance in case somebody out on the end of the pier was just so overwhelmed by the views over Lake Yanawanda and had a heart attack. The ambulance had to be okay. They couldn't get solid enough foundation to hold the weight of the ambulance, so they had to cut the pier, and it was 20, 30, 40 feet short. Just beyond there, there's another development. There's an open-air pavilion, very much like the one at Recreation Park that we showed in one of the first slides. And there's also a visitor center, restaurant complex there. And those are all built during the 1990s, again, trying to draw people to the lake. This inspired the development of some more recent lakeside developments, and Jim is going to provide some examples of that.
All right. Yep. So, as Tim mentioned, there's been always real interest in creating this area to make it more recreationally appealing to people. There was a group that formed, maybe 15 years ago, Friends of Fulton Parks, and they did several projects, including a teen park. So what you can't see is the lake. It's just right on the lake shore. We can see it in another picture. You can see how it compares to the lake, but we can go to the next slide. They also put in a trail system, as Tim mentioned. You know, there's a couple of miles of access to the lake that's public accessible, and there's a beautiful trail that now follows along the lake shore, one of my favorite places to go walking. So, and the Friends of Fulton Parks put that in. Next slide. Just as recent, you may have heard about this Dream Courts. Basketball is big in Fulton. The knee-high basketball program, thousands of kids have been through that. And through grants, including from the Bayheim Foundation, we're able to put in this beautiful outdoor court. There's Lake Ontario. If you remember, the West Side Pool used to be right where those cars are now. That was torn down. The War Memorial is off to the right. The teen park that we just talked about is kind of in that little area there where there's brownish. And if you see that trail kind of going around that, that's part of that trail system I'm talking about. So all this beautiful area that's being enhanced for our enjoyment and for your enjoyment too, since it's a public park. And let's go to the next slide.
You can also see the pier that I was talking about on the upper right corner. So Bullhead Point will be just to the right of that, to give you guys a little perspective on what I was describing earlier.
So within a walking distance of 10 or 15 minutes, there's all these beautiful places. The other thing that's happened is this great community response. A special events committee was formed 4 or 5 years ago, and they have several events, big truck days for kids to sit in big vehicles, fall festival. Most of them are in the War Memorial area, the recreation park area. Okay, I think we're going to go back to Tim.
Yeah.
Right. We've seen this picture before, but Tim's got some info for you.
And just to tag team a little bit with what Jim said, I know a number of the individuals on the Special Events Committee. Those two events listed up there draw between 5,000 and 7,000 people over a couple days when they hold those. So it's become very popular. People are aching to have something to do to draw them to the lake. Okay, getting back to this old sign that I showed you earlier. Remember I told you not to fall in love with this? Up on top is, again, kind of hard to see because it's an older sign. Nia Tawanta. you kind of may have heard me slide over that sometimes. When you live in, it's like living in Oswego, you don't pronounce the O. When I talk, and I talk fast, it's Neonawana. I stick an extra N in there. Sometimes I try to say Neotawanta and be much more, elucidate much more clearly. Jim also slides over, that's just the way that it's happened. The reason for that is the Onondagas do not have a written language. I'm sure you all know that. So when the first European settlers came in here and they heard Neotawanta, they had to try to transcribe that to the form of English, whatever they were, whether they were Dutch, they were Jesuits, or French, or English, Germanic. Now the Onondaga language is tough to render. And this would be the first time I've done this in public. When they spelled this out, they used H's to indicate what they call glottal stops. It's like when we say, uh-oh. The Onondaga language words are comprised of mostly short syllables. A lot of times it was that glottal stop at the end of the syllables. So the transcriptions at the time were putting H's and hyphens in there to separate the syllables, and H's where the glottal stops were. So Neonawana was probably pronounced something like Ni-up-ta-wanta-uh by the Onondaga Indians. Again, how do you transcribe that? How do you make that a word to have that spelling correct? So various authors and others decided, we don't want the H's in there, we wouldn't use those, not the way we speak in a smoother language than the Onondagas. Bottom line is, because of that difficulty in translating it, the various spellings were all over the board. So in 2001, entered Ed Vainer. Ed Vainer was an advertising executive in Fulton, had a big business there, who did a lot of the promotion for chambers of commerce and that sort of thing. He wrote a letter to Marion Stanton, who some of you may know, she was the head of the Fulton Historical Society back at that time. And he wrote a letter about all these variations, and basically saying, why is it spelled so many different ways? Chamber of Commerce spells it one way, county map spells it another way, the Reclamation Committee spells it a different way. So Ed's plea in the letter to Marion was, it seems as though everyone should settle on a spelling, historically correct or not, and proclaim the name as such. Well, Ed's no longer with us. He passed away a few years ago. His wife was the one who gave us this letter, Eleanor. She was a teacher back in high school. But Jim and I are willing to take on the proclamation in Ed's honor. So we are declaring that the spelling of Neotawanta now is Neatahwanta. So go to the next slide, Jim. So this is a USGS, United States Geological Survey map. The way we came up with that, that spelling, we're going to borrow, everybody here I hope is familiar with Miracle on 34th Street, proving Santa Claus exists. Well, that was our argument for coming up with that spelling. This is a USGS map. This has the spelling, you can't see it here obviously because the print is kind of small, but that has the spelling that we just said. And our logic would be, since 1901, the USGS has spelled Neotawanta this way. The USGS, the official branch of the U.S. Government Department of Interior, declares that the spelling. If it's good enough for the U.S. government, good enough for us. Case dismissed. So the spelling is cleared up. Next slide, please, Jim. Now finally, the translation. Little Lake near the Big Lake. The first time we could find that translation, some of you people may be familiar with the work of Crisfield Johnson. He wrote a history of Oswego County in 1877. And in the section on the town of Granby, he talked about Neotawanta and said that the translation, which he attributed to linguists of the time, means Little Lake near the Big Lake. He never cites who these linguists of the time are or what their source was or how that came about. And to tell you the truth, I found there's an Onondaga to English dictionary posted. I had the library borrow that, see if I could piece it together in there. That language is impossible. If any of you guys speak it fluently and I mispronounce Neotawanta wrong, let me know. But it's not really a linear, you don't just take a piece of word together and add on. It's very, very difficult. So anyways, that was what Crisfield Johnson said the translation was. However, just a few years later, next slide, Jim, sorry, thank you. So A lot of people call it Little Lake near the Big Lake, Little Water near the Great Water. In 1893, your favorite William Beauchamp chipped in. And he had his friend, Albert Cusick, who was a chief of the Onondaga clan, Onondaga tribe, the Eel clan, and was a Tenadaho, who was the chief of all 6 nations. It became 6 nations, originally 5 nations. So in his book, which I brought tonight, if anyone wants to take a look at it, excuse me a second, I'll run away. Published in 1893, this is not an original version. Indian Names in New York, which he goes around and gives the translation of Indian place names from all over New York State. And the one he uses most for this is Albert Cusick, the chief of the Onondagas. Beauchamp was able to speak Onondaga. He was well loved by the tribe. Thank you to Steve McMahon for giving us a lot of this information. And he said that Cusick translated that name as a lake hiding from the river. Now, I'll explain why we think this is a better translation. The first one, again, Chrisfield Johnson didn't say where this came from. Remember when I pointed this out, that way up north of here is Lake Ontario, 10 miles north. There were no permanent Indian settlements or Onondaga settlements in the area, but they did use it as hunting and fishing area. So imagine they're coming from the hills down by Tully, getting into Onondaga Lake, taking their unmarked canoes, coming down the rapids, coming through Fulton. Now this is all wooded. You can't see the lake from there. This is about a mile. A little farther up, remember I told you where Tannery Creek comes in by Battle Island? So taking their canoes up to there, first thing you would see is this little creek coming in. Most native traveled along water courses. So they would take their canoe up through the opening and come all the way down here. And whoa, here's a body of water. So to them, it's hiding from, we have a clue to get there. Here's this little thing. So we have water hiding near water. Now the fact that Lake Ontario is up there, there's a lot of small lakes around. So just calling it the little water near the big water. No permanent settlements. They weren't looking to get there from anywhere else. You would not go to Lake Ontario to find Lake Neenawana. You go to the Oswego River, Tannery Creek, and follow it up. So that makes more sense to us. And therefore, next slide, the title of our book. Hiding from the River, A History of Lake Neenawana and Recreation Park. Jim, you want to come up and closing remarks?
What are our closing remarks?
Well, basically, just want to say, thank you all for having us here. This is our first shot at it. Especially Steve McMahon, who did help us a lot with some of the early work with the translation.
Yeah. I think probably we can put the lights up and maybe take some questions or comments and a few more things we can talk about before we end. By the way, Tim took that picture. Tim's a photographer too, and it's a beautiful picture. The background of the book, which we can show you, we do have a proof copy of the book, is an old Valley News photograph that's exactly the same shot, same angle, and then Tim took this. So
It even has the same barbecue stand in it from 1966, I think. So that barbecue has lasted 60 years. Nobody stole it.
Questions, comments, memories of being on the lake that you want to share with me?
No, I never heard of that, and I grew up in Robbinsville as a kid, but I never heard of that lake. There was no industry whatsoever on
No.
the lake?
One of the concerns that people made when they started dredging the lake is, what can we do with the dredging spoils? Are they going to be toxic?
Right, like Onondaga.
Absolutely.
Situation,
But there was never any major industry along there. There might have been some tanneries and stuff, but they weren't dumping mercury in there. The only pollution coming in there is nutrients. The test of the sediment that was dredged out showed no toxic, like cadmium metals above EPA. EPA sets limits for them.
Fertilizer and stuff
Yep.
like that. And
Nothing above EPA
They
limits.
didn't use the water from that lake for irrigation for the farms at all at any point?
No, we did find that they did use it in an emergency for drinking water, but it had
Yeah, I
to
wondered
be treated.
if they ever used it.
At the area near Bullhead Point, just below the War Memorial, there's a pump house. The woolen mill did withdraw water from there, about 15 million gallons a day. The water apparently was the right chemistry, soft enough for the blue surge, to dye the blue surge cloth that they made there. So at one point, when the woolen mill shut down, the pump house was still there. When there were water quality or water issues in Fulton before they got the Great Bear wells up near Phoenix, they tapped into that old 12-inch main, and there was a boil water advisory in effect. Then they tried to make that a permanent backup source, but the Department of Health said, no, the water quality is not good enough for drinking water. With too much processing, the taste would be bad. But most of the farms you saw around there are fairly low. They're old mucks that were drained, so there's not really a huge need to irrigate farms that are near there. We typically have 36 inches of rain a year around here, so for the most part, we're in pretty good shape that way.
Do you think in our lifetime, the lake will ever be suitable for swimming and recreation?
It's feasible.
Maybe not in my lifetime, but for younger people.
Unfortunately, a lot of people believe it's a one-stop issue. We dredge, it's going to be all right. We clean the watershed, it's going to be all right. But lakes are complex ecosystems. It's not like an electrical circuit. You know that if you put in a 20-amp breaker, you plug a few things in, you plug in one too many, it goes kablooey. Lakes aren't like that. It's just, you do one thing, but it affects all the others. You all understand ecology, it's all interwoven. A multi-pronged approach, it's feasible. The technology is there. It's not that difficult. However, you need the capital and the political will to do it. I did early on when they first started dredging, did a back of the napkin calculation for a friend of mine. The dredging operation was fairly small and fairly limited. And just a judgment by the size of the lake, estimates from a study done anywhere from 3 to 6 feet of sediment in there. At the time, the cost of them getting a cubic yard was, I don't know, but anyways, I did a calculation saying, okay, if they need to dredge maybe half the lake, it was about $30 million just for the dredging part of it. And that was 10 years ago. So, and other things would need to be done along with that would add to that cost. And it's a long-term project and stuff, so again, is the capital there, is the political will there?
Was there thinking when they did the dredging that there were springs that were underneath the lake that would bring more fresh water into the lake?
Yes, that's what some people believe. I have not found good evidence of that, to be honest with you. I've looked at the superficial geology. Superficial geology is what was laid down after the glaciers passed. When they're melted, they drop their sediment load. There's rocks, well, depending on where it is. There aren't those kind of water-bearing sediments. They're limited in the lake bed. F.X. Brown, who did a big study for the Reclamation Committee in 1991, did basically a water budget for it. And then you find out how much rain falls in there, you measure stream inflow, you measure how much outflow is in, you find out how much is coming from each watershed and each source. And they determined that about only 7% of the water entering the lake was from groundwater seepage or wells. And looking at the superficial geology, they said that the most likely location of the wells would have been on the west side where Sheldon Creek, one of the tributaries, comes in. But in the dredging, they never found those. And again, people have the idea that these wells are just going to gush water. These might be, if cane, sand, and gravel, again, the type of cane, sand, and gravel deposits are the most likely water-bearing substrates here. They can generate 100, 200, 300 gallons a minute. It's still ain't a lot on something that's 1 billion gallons of water. So I think it's just, this was a depression in the lake, it's below the water table, water seeps in. The lake level is really, if you look at some old photos of some of the trees that are by the lake level today, the height is about where it was before. So it's not drawing down. The sediment in there may be blocking, but hydrologically, the water pressure there would just find another way to bleed up someplace else. So it could contribute to a little bit clearer water, but it is not the answer. And again, that's the problem. People think that we clear up the springs. It's only 7% of the input. Probably not going to do it. It's a multi-pronged approach.
When did the campground go in?
Jim, you want to hit that one? You did a little
that was
research
in
on it.
1969. I'm pretty sure it opened in 69. That was privately owned land that the family, was a Case family, I believe. The survivor of that family wanted to do something nice for city, so they gave that land, or I don't know if they sold that land to Fulton, and they were allowed it. I believe it was in the 60s somewhere, 69.
And then they started doing a little bit more. They enlarged it in the 70s. I had some friends that worked, I don't know if any of you remember the old CETA program. They hired kids in the summertime. It was a federal and state program to do work. They had a lot of CETA crews out there doing some of the clearing, expanding the campground, putting in a nature trail, that sort of thing. So there was a bigger expansion of it in the 70s at the initial opening.
Yeah. it's still a pretty popular place, yeah.
What's the fisheries like in the lake? Is there anything there now?
Yes, it's a very good fishery, to be honest with you. There are large bass in there, very big bigmouth bass. The problem right now is a lot of people think that the lake is polluted and you can't eat the fish. There are still large northern pike in there. One of the problems is there is a huge population of white perch, all stunted, very small. There's also some gizzard shad in there. These things are predators on the fry of bass and pickerel and northern pike and stuff. So while there may not be good, are you familiar with year classes? You know, you have a 1 pound bass, a 2 pound bass, a 3 pound bass. You might not have good year classes because of predation from the perch and the white perch and yellow perch and stuff. But the ones that survive get big. There's huge forage base for them. There's enough weed beds for them to hunt in, but you got to do a little more work than you had to do 50 years ago to find some of these. But there are big fish in there.
I ice fished there 30 years ago, and I found a lot of soft pockets where I thought there were springs coming up. You know, and maybe it was a spring, maybe it was just a lot of muck down there heating the ice.
It's possible. You'll also
very
find with the muck down there, as it decays, it does warm up, so you're going to
Yes.
get a little bit of the decay and gas coming up. It might give the impression of water bubbling up. Let's say there may be springs in there, but they're not the answer. They're not these huge gushers. You open it up, it's not like filling the bathtub.
Maybe we should put tiger muskies in there.
They actually,
No, really?
they stocked to 20,000 tiger muskies in sometime in the 90s.
Yeah.
The idea was to reduce
Yeah.
the white perch and stuff like that. And them being sterile, it would not be a self-sustaining population, but they get pretty big. They get to be 20 or 30 pounds. They caught, some tiger muskies were caught, but as far as I know, a lot of them may have just headed up the creek and out to the river and that sort of thing. So it never became the game fishery that they hoped it would become.
What's the reason for these certain species getting so plentiful that they're stunted? Do you have a theory behind it, or? No?
There's a number of theories possibly. Part of the lake used to be heavily fished, and people would take the panfish out. Once the lake started getting murkier, it became more difficult for the predator fish to find the small fish. You know, if you fish, you throw a flashy lure in there. You know, you use something flashier in dirtier water, darker water. Part was that some of the weed beds disappeared, which gave good hunting ground. It's just basically the nutrients supported a large prey base, and there aren't enough predators to control the prey base. That's basically it. It was not overfishing, it's not pollution, it's just the way the lake is working. You need to have better structure and spawning material, or spawning areas for, say, a lot of these fish, like there used to be walleye pike in there. Walleye like to spawn in gravel. You'd be hard pressed to find a gravel spot in that lake right now that is under a foot or two of silt. So all those things contributed to the decline of the fishery and the balance of the populations.
One of the chapters in the book, Tim did most of it, but I contributed a little bit. We've got a trivia, folklore, and Torpedo Joe. What kind of, there was a legend of
I believe they're calling it tiger muskie.
tiger muskie, Torpedo Joe, that was huge, and nobody could seem to catch it. And so we did a little research on whether anybody found that.
No, nobody is, Torpedo Joe is still a legend as far as we know.
Could still be in the lake.
It may still be in somebody's freezer, but they never reported it.
Any other questions, or Steve?
I just wanted to mention, you know, our name, you did mention Beauchamp. Our namesake is William Beauchamp, who was the rector of Grace Episcopal Church here in Baldwinsville. But the guy was amazing. When I started looking into this, I'd already known that some of what he'd done. He was a natural historian, he was an archaeologist, he was a biologist, he was a botanist. You said how difficult the Haudenosaunee language is to translate. He spoke it, he understood it, he translated it. He wrote over 100 books in his lifetime, and most of them were about Haudenosaunee culture, lore, you know, implements, everything. So if you ever want to go, just go down to the local library. The local library stocks probably 36 books by William Beauchamp. So he was an amazing guy. He's really a Renaissance man. And a lot of what we know about the history of the Haudenosaunee and the history of this lake, quite frankly, is due to him. So I just thought I'd bring that up, because we are named after him, and we should honor him when we can.
We do have a little more detail on basically repeating
I didn't know that.
what Steve said. It was an email, so I took some of what he said, and that is in the book, because I admire Beauchamp beyond what you can imagine. And that's, again, as Jim characterized it, that's one reason we're very comfortable using hiding from the lake rather than little water near the big water.
If Beauchamp said it, it's fact.
That's kind of our impression, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Can we take a couple more minutes for you before you go? So first of all, Tim and I are self-publishing this book. So when you're self-publishing, you're your editor, your layout, you do your graphics. So we're going painlessly through that. But you know, here's the front cover, and there's that back cover that and Tim designed all that. Just wanted you to see that. If you're interested in the book, it's probably going to be around $20. We aren't sure, but you know, maybe Steve, we could start a piece of paper, show some people.
Let's do that.
Put your phone number down there. We'll let you know. It should be within the next month. And my other books are for sale here, and if you'd like to see those, I'll be over there at the end. And I've got my Blizzard of '66 book. I've had so many phone calls. Jim, you need to write about the Blizzard of 2025. We all lived through it. This was nothing like the Blizzard of '66, but those that don't know any better, they're calling it that. My Nestle book, Mud Farms book. But can I just bend your ear for a few minutes? I have a brand new book project I'm working on. I'm looking for contributions to it. And I'm going off on a little different tangent here, but it is what I consider the kind of work I like to do, which is giving people stories. So I've always loved music. Music's been very important to me in my life. And I want to write a book about the power of music. So what I'm asking people to do is to think of a song that they remember from somewhere in their life that they somehow associate with an important time in their life. Maybe they met their life partner, or left home for the first time and there was a song playing, or overcame an illness and there was a song that inspired them. I'm asking people to write down the name of that song and just tell me their story. And my goal is to put those together in a book to talk about the power of music. So if you think you might be interested, you can either tell me the story now before I leave, because I can write it down, or I had created these little postcards that kind of capture it. You can write the story on the back and get that to me. Or do you know what a QR code is? I didn't know until 2 weeks ago. But you put your smartphone right on there. It takes you right to my website. You can type in your story and song. And you know, I've collected about 282. I won 1,000. So I'm getting there. So I'll start these around. If you think you want one, just please, I'll start half on either side. Pass them along. And thank you so much for letting us.
Thank you all very much.
I would just like to end up the meeting with a couple little notes here. Our final meeting is going to be on May 6th, our last one of the season. And our speaker that day will be Kate Kisselstein, because we were supposed to have her in January, but because of bad weather, we didn't have Kate then. So Kate is going to be at our last meeting. She'll be our speaker. And she is going to speak about Beyond the Boardwalk, Central New York, and the Long Branch Park tornado. Ooh, should be good. Yeah, should be good, because we're all familiar with Long Branch Park. So that should be very, very good. 1912. I don't remember. But anyway, thank you so much, everybody. This was great. Jim and Tim, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Everybody, we'll see you in May.